Trey Scott here with a review of The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. It was originally published in Japan in 1994, but the translation copyright for it says 2019, so it's took a while for them to translate it. But The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa is a novel about the inhabitants on an island. They don't say what the island is called, and they really don't use names in the novel. I don't think the main protagonist, who's a woman, who's a novel writer, an author, she writes novels. They never say her name. She just narrates the story basically and tells things from her perspective, but they never use her actual name. And then her editor, his name is just R. They don't. And then there's an old man in the book that was a family friend of hers that that helps her out, you know, and she just refers to him as the old man. And no one really has names in this book, which I thought was interesting, but I think it had to do with the plot, because the Memory Police, they're like a group, and they enforce things that are disappeared from the island. So, like, they'll wake up and then something will be disappeared and they'll have to throw away whatever it is. But for some reason, I don't know exactly, they don't explain, but for some reason the people know that something has disappeared, but it isn't like everything just disappeared all of a sudden. If it's in the people's house, they have to go out and throw it away, or throw it in the river, or burn it, or whatever. It was an interesting book. It's about 274 pages, I think. Not very long. The chapters are pretty short, easy to read through. And since the narrator of this book is a author, part of the book, parts of the chapters are about the story that she's making while the story is taking place. And her story that she's writing is about a typist who loses her voice, and that's what it's about. And all the books that she had previously written were about people who lost something, so it goes along with the theme of the actual book, The Memory Police, because everyone loses something, and every time something has disappeared, it's like part of the island has been, has left and gone away forever and won't be back. But there's one thing about the disappearances, is that there are some people who are immune to the disappearances, and they can remember what the things are, what they were called, what they were used for, and some of them even hide the things. But the Memory Police are going around looking for the people who are able to remember, the items that have disappeared. So that's what the Memory Police do. They go around looking for the artifacts that have disappeared and that should no longer be on the island, and then they go around rounding up the people who can remember the things that have disappeared once they have disappeared, if that makes any sense. But it's pretty good. Eventually, the narrator, the main character, I guess this goes in the spoiler territory, but her editor, R, only referred as R, she finds out that he's a person who's able to remember. So then the narrator helps R to hide in her house, basically in between floors. Her father had this little storage area, and it has a trap door, and so R stays there, and the old man helps the narrator set it up for him, basically. And the old man, he lived on a ferry, but the ferry had disappeared, so he couldn't use it, but at the same time he still lived on it, so it's kind of a gray area on the disappearances. Sometimes things still exist, but they can't use them, I guess. But then an earthquake happens in the story, and the boat sinks, but then you can see it standing out of the water, but as the story goes on, it slowly sinks, and then at the end it's completely submerged in the water. I mean, it's completely disappeared. And when the earthquake happens, the tsunami happens, and that's how the boat's destroyed. And a lot of the town is destroyed. And then at one point, the different things that have disappeared are like hats and birds. For some reason, they just got rid of all the birds. And then one of the things that disappears is books, novels. And so once the novels disappear, the narrator has no occupation anymore, and she has to find an occupation, and she works in like a herb and spice company as a typist, which is kind of ironic since she was writing a book about a typist. But once novels disappear, it's like R tells her to keep the novel she's working on about the typist who lost her voice, and R hopes to have her continue to do it, but eventually she doesn't remember how to come up with stories, basically, because she's affected by the memory police. And then eventually, I mean, this is going all the way, I'm just going to tell the whole story, basically. So eventually, one day they wake up and there's a disappearance, and they can't figure out what's going on because they're like, oh, well, something's attached to my leg. The narrator says there's something attached to my leg. And then it turns out their left legs disappeared, but it's still attached to their body, so it doesn't technically disappear. They just can't use it properly the way they were supposed to use their left leg. It was basically just dead, and they didn't have feeling in it. And so the memory police did that so they could easily figure out who could remember, because there were some people who were still living in society who were pretending to forget, but they really remembered. But once everyone was walking all funny because their left legs were messed up, then it was easy to figure out who could remember, and then they took them away. And everyone presumes that once the people who can remember are taken away, that they, are just killed. But and there was an idea that they were experimenting on them to try and figure out what in their DNA made them remember, and basically how they could get rid of that for some reason. I guess they didn't want the people to remember things or something. I don't know exactly. They never really explained why the memory police, what motivates them. They never explained what motivates the memory police and why they're having things disappear and why they're enforcing people to forget about the things that have disappeared. They never really say, they never explain that in the book. And they never really explain how they make things disappear and everyone can know, like, oh, well, this thing has disappeared, we have to get rid of it. They don't explain that either. But, I mean, it doesn't have to be explained, you know? It's still a good book, but it's just, sometimes it seems like if they would have went into more detail, if the author, Yoko Ogawa, would have went into more detail and explained things a little more, I think I would have probably got more enjoyment from the book, because it was like, what's going on? And then, like, the end of the book is pretty weird, because eventually they lose their right arms, and so they don't have left arms and right arms, and she's like, oh, so I had to learn, the narrator is like, oh, I had to learn how to type with just one left hand, but they still had their body parts attached to them. And then eventually they lose all their body parts, and they say that they're just voices floating around. And it's like, what? Voices floating around? Like, this is pretty, like, I don't know. You gotta really have imagination, I guess. But then eventually, the narrator is just a voice, and her body is useless, and the R, in his secret room, he had a bunch of other items that had disappeared, because the mother of the narrator was a person who was able to remember, and she was a sculptor, so she hid these items inside her sculptures. And then the old man and the narrator eventually discovered, the items within the sculptures. But so basically, at the end of the book, her body's in that room, and everything has disappeared. Basically, the memory police aren't there anymore because they have no one to go and take away, or have things disappeared, because basically everything's gone at this point, with the people being gone. So R is able to leave the secret room finally, and he leaves the secret room, but the narrator is stuck in it, so it's like they switch places, kind of. I think maybe that's supposed to be symbolic, I don't know. And the last chapter ends with that, and the second to last chapter, the narrator finishes her novel about the typist, and it's kind of basically the same. They kind of end the stories the same way as the narrator's actual, reality, and then the story that she made kind of ends similarly, because the typist basically disappears within the clock tower that she gets locked in by her typing teacher. But it's a little weird. Kind of have imagination to imagine it, I guess. But I would say it's okay. It made me, the memory police kept me reading it just to see what was going to happen and what was going to end, and if they ever explained how the memory police were doing and getting away with what they were doing, but they never really did. But I did thought it was interesting, and it got me reading it until the very end of the book. I would say that The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa is a decent book. I wouldn't recommend buying it, but if it sounded interesting to you, I would definitely recommend going to your public library and checking it out, because I felt it was worth my time checking it out at the library and reading it. So, The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa, I would say, is a definite check out at the library. Thank you, and enjoy reading books.